But until I could see how, if evolution is true, there wasn't necessarily conflict, that's when I was able to kind of sit down, relax a little bit, not quite have so much the fear, and really try to seek understanding. You know, I was born and raised in a Young Earth Creationist house. We really believed the Earth was just 6,000 years old, and the God kind of created everything out of scratch, and this evolution thing wasn't true. And in fact, I mean, I would hear talks like this, and I would easily be able to pick holes in it. And I don't know what your background is. Maybe you were able to do that too. I certainly was growing up. And a lot of things about human evolution in particular just seemed to be pretty ridiculous. But I'll tell you what, I did change my mind. And what I thought I really wanted to focus on today is just how I changed my mind. It's going to touch on some stuff from my book. Probably going to talk about that a great deal. But there was really 3 things that I had to see for myself. They were roughly chronological order, but it wasn't like single moments. It was stuff that happened over an extended period. And I want to tell you these 3 things that I saw. The first thing I could see is that human evolution could fit with Scripture. That was probably, and has always been, the fundamentally most important thing for me. And I'll even tell you this. Until I could see how, if evolution was true, it wouldn't conflict with Scripture, until I could see that, I had a hard time even approaching the scientific evidence. So the reason why, I mean, I was a science student. I really loved the science. As I would get into it, I'd start to understand things. And it was difficult because I would really feel a threat to some other things that I knew. I didn't know how these things fit together. And it wasn't really until I could see how they could fit together if it was true. I mean, I still thought evolution was false, to be clear. But until I could see how, if evolution is true, there wasn't necessarily conflict, that's when I was able to kind of sit down, relax a little bit, not quite have so much the fear, and really try to seek understanding. And when I started to look at the scientific evidence for human evolution, that's the other thing where I've had a real privilege just by becoming a scientist and a computational biologist. And it was probably fairly late, I would say, even in my scientific education, because there isn't really any inquisitions in the scientific education about what you personally believe, right? It's fairly late when I was really fully convinced. And I'll tell you about that. Just this key piece of it was seeing that evidence for myself and seeing how it made sense. Now, you know, Nathan went through a ton of different things. Frankly, any individual one of the things he talked about, he could have probably given a 1 or 2 hour talk on. Is that fair? And what I found out, actually, is that there was all these arguments against evolution that I'd learned. When I scratched deeper, I learned into it, I found out that it was actually fairly skin deep, or very surface level, what was being said. When I start to see all of these evolutionary arguments and really study them and understand them, I found out that there was really just a lot more underneath the surface, and there was a lot more coherence, and it was surprising to me. But I would say the last part, that wasn't enough. It wasn't just Scripture and science. I think the last part was really understanding where my foundation is and finding it in Jesus. So I'm going to talk briefly about Scripture, which is really the focus of my book. And this is one place where actually I came to a very different position than a lot of people. I'd say most Christians that came to affirm evolution really took a position where they really changed a lot of their beliefs about Genesis because they thought evolution really forced them to. For me, I actually couldn't see the conflict in the same way everyone could. I kind of talked to people about it. I didn't have it all figured out by any means, but I didn't know the scientific language to explain what was going on, but I had a sense of this fairly early on. There's something that people were missing in the conversation. That's what my book ends up being about. If you look historically to it, how Christians have really engaged with these questions of evolution, no one, until very recently, has had much of a problem with an old Earth or with evolution among animals or plants. The real challenge is human evolution. And the reason why is because what Genesis 2, 3, and 4 say, and what Romans says, and what 1 Corinthians says. It really has to do with human origins. Even if you go to the Scopes trial, William Jennings Bryan was an old Earth creationist, and he had no problem with evolution. The real key problem was human evolution. That's what the Scopes trial is. That's why it's called the monkey trial, right? And what I found out is that what people thought was in conflict really isn't. These two things can be true at the same time, both Adam and Eve and evolution. So what do I mean by Adam and Eve and evolution? By Adam and Eve, I mean two people that were created without parents. It was sometime less than 10,000 years ago. and they're ancestors of everyone. I think that's how most Christians have understood Adam and Eve over the last several thousand years. And then by evolution, I just mean that we have common ancestors with the great apes, and that our ancestral populations were large. It was never just a single couple. People just thought that those 5 things together can never be true at the same time. You have to pick and choose some of these. So you either have to kind of pick and choose from evolution or pick and choose from Adam and Eve. It turns out that all 5 of these things can be true at the same time. Isn't that cool? And people didn't know that, I would say, until my book came out, or in the lead up to my book, I would say. So how is that? Well, if you actually look at how Christians have really understood Genesis, you can see Adam and Eve here at the tip, and that's kind of humanity being formed as it kind of spreads out across the entire earth, and you can see Genesis there. And then in the New Testament, Paul talks about how we all descend from Adam and Eve. That's how it's been understood, but a key thing to keep in mind there is there's a question mark. One of the big questions as you read through Genesis that people have been wondering about long before evolution is, what about outside the garden? What's going on out there? And there's been a lot of people who have wondered about people outside the garden. Now, one way you could take it is to take that question mark and erase it and just say, well, there's no one outside. That's what some people do. That's not what Scripture teaches or says, but you could do that. And then that's when you start to have a lot of conflict with science. But that's not actually what the Genesis tradition binds us to. It leaves that as an open mystery, an open question. So what I suggested is maybe there were people outside, that God created a different way, that God created by a process of common descent that's providentially governed. Maybe he's miraculously intervening at different points, that's fine. But then at a certain point in history, God creates specially Adam and Eve, and they become ancestors of everyone fairly quickly.